We're at Nature 3, and the process that we're engaged in has a name, and it's called relearning. And it's the most complex process that there is, to relearn. Learning in the first place is something that the mind does. But relearning is something that consciousness must participate in, because it's a transform of what you had learned previously, what you had known before, into something new. Like going to digital equipment, and all of a sudden one has to relearn how you shoot, moving from a kind of a beta SP to a digital tape, and all the equipment that goes with it. And so our modern world is all based on the ability to quickly relearn. All of the education of the past was about instruction, and at its very highest end of learning, it was almost never about relearning. So that this education was necessitated by the new dimensions of our lives, by the new facts of our technology. And it hasn't yet become apparent outside of certain coteries of people. The first people who realized that you had to relearn were people about 200 years ago in the Enlightenment. Just a handful of people realized that you have to go back and recut everything that you know. And this was the basis at the time of the American and French revolutions, of the development of the critical philosophy like Kant, or the historical philosophy like Hegel. Almost none of those geniuses were able to influence education very much. The great attempt in the 19th century was to set up small communities outside of the society and again try to go back and find new ways to relate to each other, new ways to be in life, new ways to learn. And by the beginning of the 21st century, it is now a really crisis situation, because relearning has been shunted aside obliquely so often for so long that it is almost impossible for someone to be able to do this in any kind of a larger way than just to focus on following the technology or following a simple subject. And more, what is going by the wayside is the ability to relearn on an expanded differential scale that is wide enough to include our sense of being at home in the universe, or at home in our lives, or at home with ourselves, at home with each other. And so this is a very deep issue. Now we're taking in nature to begin Thoreau and the I Ching. Thoreau, because he was the pristine example, the exemplar in his day of trying to relearn and realizing that the calibration was completely off, and that any calibration that he chose to use that was major had contacts with nature that he didn't have, that his society didn't have. And so it was one of the primordial dimensions of problems and of promise in the early 19th century. Thoreau was born in 1817, and by the time he was 17 and at Harvard, 1834, the problem was enormous. The problem was in a recalibration of ourselves, or of our society. We have to find a way to go back to nature, because any calibration other than beginning with nature is extremely precarious and turns out to be artificial. The most important of Emerson's little essays was simply called Nature. And here's a facsimile of it. And it came out in serial journals, 1833, 1834. And the whole beginning of it is a difficulty with not only nature, but history, language, mind, self, consciousness, ideals, discipline, all of these things. And Emerson began, "Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes." The problem for them, by 1834, it was apparent. There must be not just a way, but there has to be a broad interface with primordial nature in order to recalibrate oneself, not just to some kind of societal ideal or some kind of inherited principles, both of which not only can be phony or false or artificial, but in fact lead one astray constantly. And so there was a great movement across the board to try to return to nature, to try to find some way to be primordial in nature again. And we are doing that here in the 21st century with our education. But to come back to the primordiality of nature, one has to do a lot of unlearning as well as relearning at the very same time. And so you have contradictory flows going on all the time. You're trying to let go of conditions and situations and methods and assumptions that are false and artificial and, in fact, detrimental, regressive in the worst possible way. The worst possible way is that one doesn't even know that they're regressive. And so one lives in delusion. It's bad enough to be subject to illusion and not knowing what to do, but to be subjected to delusion and assuming that you do know what to do is the very depths of a regression. And yet at the same time we have to relearn. And so our education is constantly churning the entire matrix of what there is and who we are and what we can do. And in order for this to find a new calibration, it has to come into play with primordiality of nature. So we're pairing with Thoreau, the I Ching, because in Chinese civilization, on the other side of the planet from us, on the other side of humanity from us, and from us is a very broad swath, everything from San Francisco to Calcutta, India. Everything from Ireland to India and all the inheritances of the European ethos that most of North and South America have, all were a part of the same kind of mind, the same kind of psyche. When Evans Wentz was investigating the fairy faith of Celtic countries and wrote a whole book on it, he constantly found that the most poignant Irish mythologies were echoed in not only India, but places like Tibet. And that's why he went to Tibet. And his next book was on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. the Bardo Thodol, and spent the greater part of his life investigating the Vajrayana in Tibet because they were very much similar to his European, his American ethos. But China is different. China has a whole different way, not only of integrating, but a kind of a different way of differentiating as well. But it isn't limited to just China. All of East Asia has this quality. Not just all of East Asia, but all of South Asia as well. The Australian Aborigines, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, and the American Indians. The American Indians, both North and South, all belong to a completely other side of the planet, other side of the world. And so when we look at the deepest quality of Thoreau, when he responds to the American Indians because they were primordial in nature in a completely different way, Thoreau actually is not far from the I Ching. He's not far from Lao Tzu. He's not far from the Chinese tradition of being primordial in nature. And because his location in Concord, Massachusetts, literally a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts, maybe the most English of American cities, you had an interface that plunged because you had the American Indians and you had the European psyche next to each other in such a way that you could take one step and be out of the one and into the other. The little town of Concord, Massachusetts, when Thoreau was a young man in the 1830s, was very genteel and very much aligned with Boston and the Harvard of the day and the various European currents of the day. Emerson himself was a great aficionado of Goethe, and most of his library were volumes either by or about Goethe or by or in translation by Carlyle, Thomas Carlyle, who was his great friend. And Carlyle's Life of Schiller, Carlyle's appreciation of all things German, and it was Carlyle's appreciation of Kant that brought the transcendental, critical philosophy of Kant into the United States through Emerson and his people, and that's where American transcendentalism comes from. And there's nothing more pristinely and poignantly European creme de la creme than Kant's transcendental philosophy, and yet next to that was still the primordiality of the American Indians. Indians still came and set up their teepees on the Concord River outside of town to have their little powwows. And you could hear the church, English church, utilitarian church psalms drowned out by the drums of the Indians just a few blocks away. So they were living in two completely different worlds, that the interface of which was a swirling complexity. And by our time, we no longer appreciate how poignant this was. And that's why Thoreau is a great figure for us, because he was never immersed in the European to the obfuscation of the American Indian. He was always capable himself of going on a vision quest just like an Indian would have. Just like an ancient Chinese would have. To go out into the wilderness, to go out into nature which is pristine, and to recalibrate oneself back to Tao, back to zero, instead of being calibrated to this principle or that, or this structure of doctrine or that. And so Thoreau is an extraordinary figure, and yet When we're looking at the I Ching with it, we're having to relearn and constantly relearn and subtly relearn. And the more that we do so, the more that we find out that East Asia had its prejudicial regressions as well. But so unknown to us is that whole context that for a very long time, very few people understood at all. For instance, the books on the I Ching that one finds now proliferate, there must be 100 or 200 volumes in the last 50 years on the I Ching. Almost all of them are useless. Useless. To think that the I Ching can be understood in terms of yin, yang, associative polarities is the height of stupidity and ignorance. And so when we come back to something like Thoreau and the I Ching, both pairs are proliferate with indications of having to relearn and to be alert about things. And so we're going to look at something today, a little bit of the I Ching, to get ourselves recalibrated away from the false academic learning, not by the West, but by the Chinese themselves, lasting more than 2,200 years. The easiest way to begin is that when you see the primordiality of the Chinese tradition, the founder of the trigrams is not just a single individual, but is always a pair of individuals, a male and a female, together. Fuxi, the dragon man, and Nu Gua, the dragon lady. Not the dragon lady in the late 19th century understanding that a bossy woman is like a dragon lady, but I mean dragon people. Here's a rubbing from a tomb from the early Han Dynasty 2,200 years ago of Fuxi and Nu Gua. They are dragon people. They are people like mermaids, only instead of having fish tails, they have dragon tails, and they are curled in just a very interesting way. They are curled the way that the double helix is curled. But they're curled in such a way that the two different dragon columns of their origination come up and play so that they tune together like a tuning fork, a calibration of how unity emerges out of Tao. And that the primordiality of it is not yin and yang, but it's Tao and Te. Tao and Te. But when one goes back to the original, early, just emerging from Paleolithic times, 3000 BC, while Fuxi has the same instrument, the carpenter's square, Nu Gua, in the most ancient, has a plumb bob. But here in the Han Dynasty, Nu Gua does not hold a plumb bob, she holds a quipu. A quipu is a knotted cord, which is the earliest way of transferring a measurement, a sequence by the knots on the cord, to put a numerical overlay onto all structures, including time, including anything in space. So that in the 3,000 years from the original Fuxi Nu Gua to the Han Dynasty version of Fuxi and Nu Gua, it is the feminine dragon capacity that has undergone a radical change. In the original, the feminine was always the way to find one's center of balance based on, like the plumb bob, the way in which the symmetry of energy rotation has its axial verticality so that one then can base one's structure on a real centering, a real balance. And that the synergy and the symmetry of the energy distribution are put throughout the entire structure. It has what Buckminster Fuller used to call tensegrity. Whereas by the Han Dynasty, in the Han Dynasty about 200 BC, they were the Chinese Romans. Really Romans, really Chinese. New Gua now is not holding a plumb bob for that kind of synergy, that kind of tensegrity, that kind of symmetrical energy in its rotational distribution, but the quipu is an imposition of a numerical structural design that more complements the carpenter square of Fuxi, so that you have an understanding of the I Ching which is masculinized. It's lost its feminine originality. It is now a masculine ideation rather than a universal paired calibration. And in that masculine idealization of about 200 BC, the movement of it had several different origins. One of them is the fact that the yin-yang chia, the yin-yang school, had come into dominant play. Because the yin-yang school, if you're working with the polarity of yin-yang, you can do all kinds of associated instructional proliferations, and then you have all kinds of diagrammatic codes and rules, and you can teach and test people on it, and everything becomes mechanically sophisticated. And to make up for the lost mystique in that kind of abstract drawing out of process, there is a concomitant that comes along with it, and that's a kind of a metaphysical, magical, unknown quality that's not there in nature or there by someone like a Lao Tzu or a Thoreau or a Fuxi, but people who were court magicians. They're called Fang Shi in Chinese. And the Fang Shi were professional court magicians, and they practiced literally magic and mysticism in the most derisive way of making big displays of stuff, powdered pink smoke, and all of a sudden you've got stuff playing. It's just like a Hong Kong movie now, with that kind of trick magic paired with the super logical instruction on the way in which polarities distribute. Yin-yang is, and then people are supposed to be this way, society is this way, the universe is supposed to be this way. And so you get this mixture of sophomoric magic and supercilious logic together. And that is the sycophantic court ethos that so many people have assumed now is what the I Ching is all about. It's not at all. So in order to appreciate on a Thoreau level, on a Fuxi New Gua level, on a Lao Tzu level, the I Ching, one has to go back and make a primordial interface with nature oneself. And the first way, in order for us to do that, is to put our relearning into the simplest activity imaginable. And it's not about sitting like Descartes and then thinking, well, I think, therefore I am. There's nothing primordial about that at all. But the most primordial thing that we can do is to take a walk. just to take a simple walk, a random walk, and understand that we are just taking a walk. One of the nice little early volumes on Thoreau, this was published in Boston, 1873. Thoreau, the poet naturalist. William Ellery Channing was a friend of his. Chapter 7 is all about walks and talks. Channing asked him, "And so, are you ready for a walk?" And his reply was, "When was I ever not? Where shall we go?" The whole endeavor of beginning our education, our learning, our relearning, by that assignment of a couple of weeks ago, just to simply take a walk from wherever you live, around where you live, and come back to where you live. And then to repeat that with one difference, and one difference only, that you index the second walk by some primordial element. Water, fire, air, earth, space, whatever it is, and that second walk is similar to the first walk and different in only that one aspect. There's a very sophisticated thing. A mathematician named Gauss came up with the ability to mathematize the differential of only one element in a very huge complex, and out of this came a great development of higher mathematics. We're just doing it as a part of our investigation of relearning, beginning with nature, and we're going to proliferate this not in an idea sense or a principle sense or a learned sense or somebody's code, but we're going to do it originally. So we're learning originally just now for the very first time in the sense that we're relearning. And so we don't want to push it. We don't want to dominate it. We don't want to have diagrams that tell us, oh, this is where you are right now. We don't have those coordinates yet. We're going to let them emerge, let them develop. And this was the whole origin of the way in which the I Ching began. When you look at the most ancient presentation of the I Ching, it is not in terms of the I Ching that we would even recognize because the hexagrams are not there. What is there are the trigrams. And yet, when you come to something even as sophisticated as this volume, Li, Qi, and Shu, An Introduction to Science and Civilization in China, Hong Kong University Press, I think it was 1985, Ho Peng Yoke, who was a student and then at Cambridge University in England under Joseph Needham, whose great 20-volume work and still going on is called Science and Civilization in China. Joseph Needham, cigar-smoking Cambridge Don, who was one of the greatest investigators of scientific history, he and his wife. And his Science and Civilization in China is the first time that anybody ever took a survey of science in China. So every major university, every major public library in China will have Science and Civilization in China in English because that's where it was written and published for the first time. When you look at Ho Peng Yoke's Li, Qi, and Shu, Chapter 5, the system of the I Ching, right away you find the standard numerology understanding. The term Shu, numbers, embodies the meaning of Yishu, numerology, with the system of the Book of Changes, derived from Yi Ching, the Book of Changes. And then there are two cosmological forces, yin and yang, derived from the Taiji, are represented by a broken line and a full line. And by combining these in 4 possible ways, you have 4 symbols. And then by adding another pair to them, you get 8, and you multiply it, you get 64. All of this is academic gobbledygook. And then to consider yourself learned because you can mimic this. And then you develop some kind of metaphysics on that, or some kind of insights based on that, and then you write a book on the I Ching. You can see that the world is a junkyard in terms of learning and is a desert in terms of relearning. Almost no one that one would meet has any understanding that is original and primordial. And yet it's this calibration that we're engendering by our process here. And all of the complexities that we're working with constantly have a shared ability to let form emerge originally, pristinely, out of the Tao, the zero, the emptiness, because it's the way in which unity emerges whole. Babies are not born an arm at a time, a leg at a time, they're born whole. It's the emergence of wholeness that is the basis of unity and not yang. And that unity, its designated name in Chinese is Te. And that unity occurs in a very mysterious way. Because when it emerges not out of something. That would have been a previous Te then. But it emerges seemingly from emptiness, from nothing. And yet, in its emergence, the fact of its emergence indicates that unity itself, A, is emergent, and B, look at how we want to diagram right away. Look how we want to put into some kind of intellectual ordering. The whole realization of Fuxi and Nügua was that this is not the way that one can proceed. That unity is a oneness, but not a number one, but a oneness. And that it has a interface that is direct and primordial with zero. That 1 and 0 are not a binary in the sense of a polarity, but that they are a pair in terms of some kind of superset that exceeds the mind's ability to put an order on it. And that in that superset, the zeroness has a fertility that allows for unity to be born. So that Tao and Te, in their primordial pairedness, have a quality that allows for not just form, but all formality, objectively, to emerge, and not just once, but to emerge all the time. So that iteration is a quality of the way in which objectivity occurs in reality. It's always occurring. And so one needs to find, they used to say there are 3 kinds of change. One is non-change. The other is a change that's cyclic. And the third is there's a change in sequence. And all of that is later Han Dynasty and after inculcation. The original 8 trigrams by Fuxi and Nügua are concerned with keeping track of the way in which Te emerges, and as it emerges, Tao lends itself to that emergence and undergoes a kind of a parallel to the way in which Te will emerge. And so Tao has its own cycle. Not a cycle of oneness, but a cycle that is the complement to oneness. And so the broken line is not a broken line, it's a space indicated by the two halves of a line that doesn't continue, doesn't meet. It's the space. And the unbroken line is not yang, but is the unity of Te in its emergent objectivity, and that these two have registries where they occur in such a way that that registry lends itself to becoming elements of structure and stages of process at the very same time, so that one gets structure and process out of the two of them. And they follow in a quality of pairedness all the way through. And so in order to make the levels of registry of the changes of Te and the changes of Tao apparent, Fuxi made the 8 trigrams. And that first time that he made the trigrams was not about male and female, not about yin and yang, but was a deep vision quest into nature. And what he saw originally was a thunderstorm in the mountains. He exposed himself like Thoreau once, becoming a surveyor in a snowstorm, and stood with the trees in a snowstorm just to be there with them, that someone needed to do this. And Fuxi, 5,000 years ago, was at one with a thunderstorm in the mountains. And let the registry of the stages of the process of the storm in nature occur to him. And the original trigrams were the way in which those stages of that happening occurred. There was thunder, and there was lightning, and there was rain, and the rain collected and became pools and ponds. And when the storm was past, the pools reflected the mountain. And out of that whole ecology was a return back to the pre-thunderstorm in the mountains. And one could then have any number of thunderstorms in the mountains, and one would know not the form of it, but one would have an interface to the primordial occurrence of it. And out of those images came the first images of the trigrams. So that fire and water are linked together not as ideas, not as opposites, but they are linked together pristinely in nature as primordiality, lightning and rain. And so when we will see after the break and come back and see that fire and water, those two trigrams, are the exchange node by which the whole process becomes complementarity. It isn't because of some idea of fire and water. It's that in nature, this is a primordiality that occurs. Let's take a little break and we'll come back. In the notes to my translation of the I Ching, when I was working on it 12 years ago, it was at the same time that I was helping make a translation of Zarathustra. Zarathustra's Gathas are from about 4,000 years ago. And there's a great similarity between the world of Zarathustra of 2000 BC Iran and the beginnings of dynastic China. In the Tao notes, you'll find a whole section that's a correlation of Tao and Vayu. Vayu is a term in the ancient language of Zarathustra, which was Avestic. Avestic is an ancient Indo-European language that is as old as Sanskrit. Vayu in Avestic actually is very difficult because later on in Irani lore, the Pahlavi language translated Vayu as way, and in Farsi, Ve is supposed to be a stand-in for it, and yet there's another word in Farsi meaning void, tuhigi, tohi, empty, tuhigi, void. All this in correlation to the ancient Avestic Vayu. In Zarathustra, it's very clear that if you can talk about Vayu, then you're talking about something else. It's like in Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching, where he says, the name that can be talked about is not the eternal. It is the mother of all things, but is not what is real. Is there in apparency, and the apparency is that of the iterative vibration of the way in which existence occurs. What's interesting about Fuxi and the hexagrams is that it is one of the earliest levels. It's back to 3000 BC, 1,000 years before Zarathustra. 1,000 years before dynastic China. And early dynastic China, the Xia dynasty was always considered as a phantom dynasty by Western academics or by Chinese who were educated in Japanese universities, and they didn't want to let on that there were great similarities between dynastic China and the Irani ethos of the day. But about 2000 BC, there was a great exchange between Central Asian Iran, not the southern Iran that was very close to the Euphrates civilization. The southern Iran is a completely different kind of Iran. And that Euphrates-Tigris civilization from Sumeria through Akkad has great affinities with the development of Judaism. The Akkadians were Semitic people. Sargon of Akkad was a Semite. You can see in the gold mask that has survived features that are still Semitic. And one understands, oh, this is how it is. But Zarathustra is of a completely different lineage, a completely different type, and his template of understanding was not the dance rhythms of the earth, but it was the occurrence of celestial phenomenon. And his name, Zarathustra's name translated into Greek, Zoroaster, means stargazer. Someone who looks to the stars, someone who looks to the celestial for a template, and in doing so, Zarathustra shows a backflow from ancient China. Because Zarathustra is from the area of Central Asia, which today is Uzbekistan, Samarkand, Bukhara. And in his day, there was a backflow from China, just as in Zarathustra's day, there was a flow from Iran into China that produced dynastic China. But the original China that had a backflow and influence Zarathustra is a China which is still Paleolithic. Like the American Indians in Thoreau's day were still Paleolithic. Fuxi in Chinese lore is the patron god of hunting. It's a Paleolithic concern. And that keeping track by the stars, by celestial phenomena, by the celestial experience that comes into the interface of nature, is of a completely different type from something which one gets from the earth. Yes, they are related, but there's a distinct emphasis that's different, celestial and terrestrial. In Greek mythology, there were two distinct types of heroes. The terrestrial hero always goes to the beyond and brings what he can back to improve life, where the celestial hero leaves. The Buddha was a celestial hero. I want out of here. Finito. Whereas the terrestrial hero, his password is not finito, but bendito. I want to take something from there and bring it back. I want the goods. I want the treasure. We're talking about primordiality. The Paleolithic is distinctly different. It's a different mode. The Neolithic is all about taming. The Paleolithic is all about participating in the wild. If you have never participated in the wild primordially, you don't get it. You don't understand. There is a torrential flow that you can't think about in Paleolithic primordiality. Whereas in the Neolithic, what you're doing all the time is making sure that the process follows the cycle of nature. So it's about following. And in the Paleolithic, the primordial taming is the taming of grain. That's why the phrase is bread is the staff of life. That's why the communion is bread. This is my body. Because the taming of grain is the only way in which it occurs. Wild grains don't have enough substance to provide nutrition. You would have to garner acres and acres in order to get enough to make a loaf of bread. The wild goat grass that bread wheat comes out of had to be tamed twice. The Paleolithic goat grass had to be turned into a genetically modified bread, which was not yet complete, and that grain had to be modified a second time to give us, it's called emmer. And all the energy that went into the wild plant was mediated twice and condensed, integrated twice, so that bread wheat has all of its energy that goes into the kernels that make up the grain. But it no longer has the ability to seed itself in nature. It no longer has the extra kind of plant stem material that were like wings for the goat grass so that the wind in rural areas of California, you can see ryegrass that seeds itself and it looks very much like wheat, like a primordial wheat, and it turns a golden brown, and no one has to sow it or tend it, it just seeds itself by the wind. Vayu in a Vestic is like that wind that seeds reality through the iteration of emergence all the time. It happens naturally. Life emerges as existence naturally from the Tao in Vayu. And if you go through a transform where you condense a portion of it for some reason or another, then something will lose something in compensation. And if you do it a second time, the first time is usually called a transform, which is like the word now comes from the complement to it. Along with grain is always the fruit, and the chosen fruit is the grape, and the chosen transform is the wine. The water's turned into wine. This is my blood. But it's that wine has a transform which takes yet another further transform. And that further transform of wine is a distillation that turns the wine into cognac. And bread wheat is a second further transform, so that bread and wine are on the same index. They are twice transformed or thrice greatest. They exist on a third refinement, on a third level. And once one gets to a third level, once one has the primordial, the Paleolithic, then you have a transform to the Neolithic, which is a taming of something, and then you have a further refinement of it, and the Neolithic refines to civilization. But civilization now is removed from primordiality by at least 2 levels. So that civilization has a very wonderful capacity, and it has a huge compensation to make up for. It's lost the ability to have itself seated in nature, so that people that are civilized are not real in a natural way. They don't have any sense of Tao at all. They don't have any sense of value at all. They're not paleolithically available for the winds of reality to blow through them. I think it says in the Gospel of St. John, the wind blows where it will. No one knows where it came from, and no one knows where it goes. The earliest Old English great poem is about this banquet hall where all the nobles are together, and out of an open window a bird flies in from the night outside and flutters around for a little bit, surveying everything, and flies back out again. And that this is the mystery of life. This is the Tao. That bird, that spirit has come from the Tao and goes back to it. It is only here for a little while, and we don't know where it came from, we don't know where it goes. This is the compensatory lack of civilization. It's not because it's wrong, that's how it is. But it's not just a remove from nature, it's a remove from a remove of nature. Civilization is a development of the Neolithic, and the Neolithic is already a development from the Paleolithic. So that when one looks at Fuxi, one is looking at the Paleolithic wisdom has not yet been transformed by the Neolithic, and in China, in the I Ching, the Neolithic stage is the I Ching of the 64 hexagrams. And it comes from the founding of the Zhou dynasty about 1150 BC, about 3,000 years ago. The Zhou-yi, that's what the I Ching is called. The Zhou-yi, the book of Zhou, the book of the Zhou dynasty, the founding of the whole dynasty. And the founder of that dynasty is not the first king, but the father of the first king. The first king of the Zhou dynasty is King Wu. And he, in retrospect, said, well, my father was the first king. Even though he never ruled, he's the first king, King Wen. And King Wen, in prison, because he lived at the tail end of the last of the Shang dynasty, the dynasty just before the Zhou. And he had 3 sons. And it is King Wen who makes the hexagrams of the I Ching out of the trigrams of Fuxi, but he transformed Fuxi's Paleolithic celestial order of the trigrams into his Neolithic order of the hexagrams. So that by the time we get to an I Ching which can be translated, that I Ching has already undergone a transform from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic. And we'll come back to it and see that the King Wen and his 3rd son, the Duke of Zhou, put together the I Ching in a way in which we would begin to understand that, well, this seems like the I Ching, but it isn't quite yet, because there was a second transform of the I Ching out of the Neolithic into the civilized. And the man who transformed it out of the Neolithic of King Wen and his 3rd son, the Duke of Zhou, into civilization was Confucius, Confucius. And it is Confucius, about 500 BC, who makes the I Ching a civilized book. So you have Fuxi, 3000 BC, who has a Paleolithic 8 trigrams, that's a celestial order. You have the Neolithic of the Zhou dynasty, King Wen and his 3rd son, the Duke of Zhou, that makes a Neolithic 64 hexagram structure. And then you have Confucius, who adds commentaries to it. Whole series of commentaries. They're called the wings, because they're just like the goat grass that couldn't seed itself. It lost those natural wings. So Confucius is the civilized hand that throws the grain so that it can proliferate, and it provides it. The hand are the commentaries. And without the commentaries, the civilized I Ching cannot be used, cannot be understood, cannot be practiced. Just like bread wheat has to be sown by hand. So one of the most interesting beginnings of civilization is whenever you begin to find illustrations that show human beings using their hands to toss the grain. And where do you get this grain? You take a percentage of the fresh harvest of the grain in order to seed it so you'll have grain next year. This is the origin of tithing. It's also the origin of sacrifice. It is a sacrifice of first fruits so that the cycle will continue again. And without that, nothing is going to continue, because now you are removed from nature, and then you're removed from that remove. And without understanding where it is that you are, you will perish, because you're now in abstractville. And without the hand-sewn quality of commentarial additions to give it wings so that it is then a part of reality still, without that compensation that's necessary, you drift further and further away from reality. Not just from reality, but from the middle stage that was already separated from primordiality. So the difficulty with civilization is that it tends to mistake drifting from the Neolithic as being the source of the problem, and if you can correct that, then you have the solution. And that's idiocy. The problem is that you are no longer Paleolithic. So one has to learn to go back through the seeming nature, back to the real nature, and one can't go back to the real nature because it's not objective. The seeming nature is objective because it's existence. It's ritual comportment, ritual action. You can go back to the existentials. But these are not real. These are only Neolithic artifacts of existence. And existence itself is an artifact in the sense that it is not Tao, it is Te. So there's a very deep mystery involved in being civilized that one has to keep track of at least 3 different levels, 3 different registries of energy, and then learn that those 3 together constitute a 4th, a gestalt which is the integral of the essential core of the 3 previous stages. So that there's something called the 4 quarters, something called the square, and it's indelible for civilization. So the saying in China, a civilized sage, a civilized Taoist, his eyes have square pupils. And his eyes are not dark, they are bright. They see enlightenedly. They see light through the square of the pupils. So that wherever the sage looks, the sage structures a 4-level quality of wholeness all the time and sees that way not by rote but by creativity, because one can't do it by rote. The letter of the law kills. If you encode it, you're dead. So the whole question was there has to be a way to keep from getting entrapped in the projected and retrojected formality, which is not only there in symbols, but there in rituals as well. Because there is something in the ritual existence that is already different from the primordial real. And symbols take it even a further refinement away from that. It's like the ritual is like the Neolithic, and the symbols are like the civilized quality, and yet there's a process that is available in between symbol and ritual, and that is myth. And mythic experience is the experience of languaged feeling put into images. So that the images of feeling constitute a fundamental language. So that feeling-toned images have a quality which is very parallel to the primordiality of the real. We're used to thinking that images somehow are not the real thing. They are the real thing. They flow, and as long as they flow with the Tao, those images are real. So that the preservation of imagery is one of the great tasks of being refined enough in civilization to be able to know that this is what needs to be done. And the refinement of imagery in that sense is what produces art. So that art is indispensable to civilization. And yet, the process of experience needs not to follow nature, but to be at one with it. So that there is they used to call it merging, like merging in the sense that whatever emerges out of experience then, whatever emerges out of feeling-toned images, has a Paleolithic quality of the real to it. And this, of course, is a language that's put into the rhythmic chant of great holy and sacred the structures of process. And out of that will come poetry. Out of that will come the songs. When Fuxi and Nuguan are making the trigrams, it was not in their participation with nature to make hexagrams. When King Wen and his son, the Duke of Zhou, King Wen made the hexagrams, and his third son, the Duke of Zhou, did the lines. Now that you have just two trigrams put together making a hexagram, changes the whole gestalt. The hexagram is different than two trigrams brought together. And it meant then that each line now had to have its own understanding within the symbolic structure. But because the Duke of Zhou, being the third son, and in China, the third son has to be very circumspect. The first son usually is the one who would do the inheriting of the patriarchal family quality. And so the trigram in the Neolithic, for the beginning of the unbroken line, in Fuxi it was called the arousing, like thunder. In the Neolithic, it's called the first sun. Same trigram. But for Fuxi, it's thunder, it's the arousing, it's the beginning of the way in which the ecology of that mountain storm occurs. And for Fuxi, the important thing was the participation in the mysterious continuity of nature. The French phrase, participation mystique, that Lucien Lévy-Bruhl found in investigating, trying to understand the Paleolithic mind. He's a great contemporary of Henri Bergson and Marcel Proust, and Lévy-Bruhl, like the great French of that generation, apprenticed themselves to Plotinus, who was primordial. Plotinus could go back to the Paleolithic quite easily, even though he lived in the center of Rome. Like Pythagoras, who could go back to the primordial, was like a Paleolithic sage. And Lévy-Bruhl wrote a book. Among many, he investigated how is it that primordial man, Paleolithic man, works, and one of his great books is How Natives Think. That one has to go back and become a native in nature all over again, pristinely, and when one does, you don't go to learn. You go to be there with it, to be at one with it, like Thoreau. And when Thoreau went back, he found again and again that there was a quality that was elusive if you were hanging on to the civilization that was there. And yet, the normal way of gaining back what you had lost was to go back to a Neolithic level, pre-civilization, like going from the city to going to the country. The Neolithic is like the country, like farms. Whereas the civilized is like cities. So the city person thinks they're going to go back to nature by going back to the farm. And Thoreau found that you have to leave the farm and go back to the wilderness. That the Paleolithic is in the wilderness. And it's not there to be found. It only occurs when you just simply occur with it. And you don't know. There's no way of knowing, because that knowing is at least several removes away, several energy registry phases away from the Tao, from Vayu, from the pristine Paleolithic mystical participation with the mysteriousness of nature. And that while nature is change, the change doesn't register symbolically at all in the Paleolithic. It doesn't register in ritual at all, but it does show itself like a revelation in the feeling images of the way one speaks when one is immersed in nature. So that what comes out of that is a kind of a languaging of the mystery of nature. Now, in Chinese tradition, after the severe experience of catastrophic collapses of false dynasties, many of them, after finding that this had happened not only once or twice or thrice, but was happening again and again, that what had happened is that man was on some kind of a tie line to keep repeating catastrophic failure, and it was getting worse and worse each time, much like our own age. And that they were not going to be able to survive again. Lucretius in 50 BC, when he wrote his great esoteric physics, the De Rerum Natura, the way nature is, he said of his own time, we are so ill from false civilization that we're going to die, and yet we are so weakened that we can, if we try the cure will kill us. We can neither endure the disease nor the cure. And of course, the only way to deal with that is that one has to go outside of the disease cure set in order to find not a resolution, but an expansion that dissolves the problem so that it doesn't occur in the first place. We are much in the same way. If we stay in the civilization that has died, it has died. All of us will die. And the new civilization that can be brought in cannot be the same kind of form that the old civilizations were, because they die. We know now that they die. So it has to be different. Different. And in China, the great example of the almost successful way of making a new kind of dynasty was the Tang. And the founding of the Tang by Tang Taizong is very much a replay of the way in which the Zhou dynasty was founded. Tang Taizong said the first emperor of the Tang dynasty was his father, not him. Just like King Wu said, well, it's my father. Made him a king posthumously. It's King Wen. And when one sees the way in which, I think I have it in the Tao notes, the way in which King Wen is portrayed, he's always portrayed with his wife. They're like another resonance of Fuxi and Nuguang. That these two qualities together make a set which in itself is fertile to allow existence to come originally out of Tao. That life is made pristinely new. The baby, Lao Tzu says, nothing has more Tao than the baby. To be like a newborn baby as a matured, civilized human being is to have emerged not only whole, but to emerge back in a return to the real. And so the whole notion in the I Ching is that change is a calibration of energy cycles whose phases make a return. One is always able to come back again and emerge again fresh. And as long as that ecology holds, then the final stage of that ecology is what the Chinese call qi, the energy of life. That qi is a part of the way in which the final phase of the integral energy cycle opens back up again to a return to the Tao. It is primordial. And without understanding that, one doesn't understand at all. In that ecology, energy calibrates at special nodes, which are phases, and that those phases together form the cycle of the real. It's not a cycle that goes to the top and then just stays there. It's a cycle that comes to an exchange at its centers and a complementarity at its crest. The exchange at the centers is the way in which the Neolithic level of taming plants and animals in oneself occur, and in the trigrams this is fire and water. The trigram for fire can work in the column of the unbroken line, and the trigram for water can work in its complementary, and they work just as well. So that the center, the second energy registration of Tao in its energy registration, can work in life as if it were a natural part of it. The way it was told to me, I remember Kayushu saying, it's a mystery, but it's of this kind. If you had to have a temporary infusion of seawater in your veins, it would for a while function with the blood. But if you put fresh water in your veins, you would be killed immediately. The primordial cannot be addressed immediately from civilization. It would be radioactive to us. The universe is radioactive. One has to go to it by returning to it through keys, differential consciousness. To try to go back is the same kind of idiocy of practicing some kind of metaphysical holiness, because, let's use the example that they used to give in China, the man withholds ejaculation so his semen will go back into his own body and will fertilize his own body. This is metaphysical nonsense. This is another form of masturbation. And yet, thousands of years of Chinese false Taoism still embraces this kind of foolishness. It's a complete misunderstanding. We're going to come back next week and take a look at the way in which the three registries of energy in the trigrams leads to a fourth gestalt of occurring. And it's much like getting the three angles of a triangle and then realizing there's a center. And that when one realizes that there's a center, one realizes that the square also has a center, which is like a fifth. So just like in music, thirds and fifths are indicative of a structural freedom of composition. And while one can keep time by twos and fours, one composes by threes and fives. Let's come back next week.